An Amish man ordered a young bride, but a 60-year-old woman stepped off the wagon. The townsfolk burst into laughter. Dust swirls in the street. The church bell tolls as the widower lowers his head in shame. But this woman doesn't flinch. With silver hair and steady eyes, she claims a place no one expected. By lamplight, she heals a fevered child. And whispers spread. Maybe this stranger isn't a mistake. Maybe she's a miracle. Yet shadows close in. A mining company rides hard with rifles and papers, swearing they own his land. And hidden in the widow's trunk lies a set of treaty papers that could save everything or destroy them both. Now in a town ready to laugh them out, a farmer and an aging bride must stand against greed, secrets, and the weight of the past. But can love be found in the most unlikely of places, or will the truth buried in her hands tear it all apart? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Miller's Creek Depot as Amos Yoder shifted his weight from one polished boot to the other. He had spent the morning preparing, even asking his eldest to help him trim his beard neat and proper. Now he stood, his black hat clutched tight, watching dust rise from the approaching stage wagon. Around him, townsfolk gathered like chickens at feeding time. Mrs. Miller swept her porch for the third time, stealing glances his way. The general store owner, Theodore Banks, leaned against his doorframe, not even pretending to sort his displays anymore. Mighty fine day to meet a bride, ain't it, Yoder? Called Jim Preston from the telegraph office. A few snickers followed. Amos kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw set firm against the whispers. He had endured months of this. The sidelong looks, the barely hidden smirks when word got out he'd arranged for a mail-order bride. But his children needed a mother, and his farm needed another pair of working hands. The letter writer had promised someone suitable, young enough for field work but experienced with children. The stage wagon's wheels clattered over the wooden bridge, horses' hooves striking the steady rhythm that matched Amos's quickening heart. He smoothed his plain black vest, remembering the careful words he'd practiced. Welcome to Colorado territory. I trust your journey was comfortable. The wagon drew to a stop in a cloud of dust. Amos noticed more folks drifting over, the blacksmith, wiping his hands on his apron, two ranch hands pausing their loading of feed sacks. Even Reverend Matthews had stepped out of the church, prayer book in hand. Looks like the whole town came to see Yoder's purchase, someone muttered, followed by poorly concealed laughter. The driver, old Pete Wilson, climbed down and opened the wagon door with a flourish. Last stop, Miller's Creek. Amos stepped forward, ready to assist his young bride, but his rehearsed greeting died in his throat. Instead of the fresh-faced woman he'd imagined, a tall figure in a neat gray traveling dress emerged. Silver hair crowned her head like a halo in the late-day sun, and fine lines marked a face that spoke of at least 60 years of living. The woman gathered her carpet bag and stepped down with surprising grace. Her back was straight as a fence post, her eyes clear and steady as she surveyed the shocked faces around her. I am Angel, she announced in a voice that carried quiet authority. I believe you are Mr. Yoder? The silence that followed felt thick as molasses. Then someone snorted and the dam broke. Laughter rippled through the crowd, barely muffled behind hands and handkerchiefs. Reckon she's a mite more seasoned then. You was expecting Yoder, called out Tom Baker from the livery. Heat crawled up Amos's neck, burning his ears. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced with calculations, the cost of the arrangement, the return fare, the shame of it all. But Angel stood unflinching, her carpet bag held firmly in work-worn hands. There was something in her bearing that made the laughter sound hollow, almost foolish. Her eyes met his, not pleading or apologetic, but patient, waiting. There must be some mistake, Amos finally managed, his voice rough. Perhaps, Angel replied evenly. But mistakes sometimes have purpose, Mr. Yoder, if we're willing to see it. The stage wagon driver was already climbing back up to his seat, eager to be away from the awkward scene. The horses stamped restlessly, harness jingling in the heavy quiet. Amos looked at the woman before him, not young, not what he'd asked for, not at all what he needed. But something in her calm dignity made him hesitate. The thought of sending her away immediately, like damaged goods to be returned, stuck in his throat like a fishbone. I reckon you'll need a place to rest until this can be sorted," he heard himself say. The words came out stiff, formal. Angel inclined her head slightly. "Much obliged, Mr. Yoder." Together they walked away from the depot, leaving whispers and stares in their wake. Their footsteps fell out of sync on the dusty road, an awkward rhythm that seemed to echo the strangeness of their situation. Ahead lay his farmstead, where his children waited, expecting a young mother to be. Instead, he was bringing home a woman old enough to be their grandmother. Amos cast a sideways glance at his companion. Angel walked steadily beside him, her carpet bag swinging gently, as if this was exactly where she had meant to be all along. The thought unsettled him more than all the town's laughter combined. The farmhouse kitchen glowed warm in the early evening light as Amos set out 4 tin plates on the worn wooden table. His children, Jacob and Mary, perched on their usual bench, shoulders touching as they stared at Angel with undisguised curiosity. The stranger's silver hair caught the lamplight as she stood quietly by the hearth, her hands folded at her waist. "Children," Amos said stiffly, "this here is Miss Angel. She'll be our guest until things are." He cleared his throat. "Until things are corrected." Mary's small fingers twisted in her apron. "But Papa, you said." "That's enough now," Amos cut in, ladling out the bean soup he'd prepared that morning. The spoon clinked against the bowls with sharp little sounds in the awkward silence. Angel moved toward the table with measured grace. "May I offer thanks for the meal?" she asked, her voice gentle but carrying an assurance that made it more statement than question. Amos gave a short nod, and Angel bowed her silver head. "Dear Lord," she began, her words flowing smooth as creek. "Water, we thank thee for this bounty and the shelter of this home. Bless these little ones, and grant us all thy peace this night. Amen." The simple prayer brought a hush over the table that lingered as they began to eat. Jacob sneaked glances at Angel between spoonfuls, while Mary openly studied the older woman's face. After the meal, Mary brought out her cherished rag doll, its dress hanging sadly from one shoulder. "Can you?" she started shyly, then stopped. "Would you like help mending her dress?" Angel asked, reaching for her sewing basket. Mary nodded eagerly. As Angel threaded a needle with practiced ease, Jacob edged closer, drawn by the peaceful scene despite himself. "Did you really come all the way from Santa Fe?" he asked suddenly. "I did indeed," Angel replied, her fingers working steadily at the tiny stitches. "I've traveled the Santa Fe Trail more times than I can count. Would you like to hear about the time I saw a herd of buffalo so vast it took 3 days to pass?" Jacob's eyes widened. 3 whole days? From his place by the stove, Amos listened, as Angel's voice painted pictures of prairie grass waving like a golden sea, of wagon wheels creaking under the hot sun, of buffalo dust rising like storm clouds on the horizon. Her words were simple but chosen with care, and even he found himself drawn into the tale, yet suspicion coiled in his chest. What sort of woman her age would agree to marry a stranger? What was she really after? The agency had promised someone suitable, young, strong, able to work. Instead, they'd sent. He couldn't finish the thought. Angel's steady hands were fixing Mary's doll with such tender attention, and Jacob had crept so close he was nearly touching her skirts, hanging on every word about trail life. When the children were finally tucked into bed, Amos stepped out into the night air. The barn's familiar outline stood dark against the stars as he paced, boots crunching on scattered hay. He needed to write to the agency immediately, demand an explanation, arrange her return journey. But the memory of Angel's quiet dignity at the depot still pricked at him. Inside his small study, he lit the lamp and pulled out paper and ink. The nib scratched across the page. "Dear Sirs, I must inform you of a grave error in the arrangement we discussed." He knew it might be weeks before he received a reply. The thought of weeks with this stranger under his roof made his shoulders tense. Yet what choice did he have? He couldn't simply turn her out, not at her age, not after she'd traveled so far. Up in the barn loft, Angel smoothed the rough blanket on her straw mattress. The familiar words of Psalm 23 brought comfort as she whispered them into the darkness. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The old timber walls creaked around her, and somewhere below, a horse shifted in its stall. Such different sounds from her years on the trail, yet somehow soothing in their own way. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but the children's open faces gave her hope. Their father's resistance she had expected. Time would tell if God's purpose in bringing her here would become clear to him as it had to her. Farmhouse settled into night quiet, broken only by the occasional scrape of Amos's chair as he labored over his letter. Though they slept under the same roof, miles of uncertainty stretched between them. A cold wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter by Mary's window with a hollow sound that echoed the emptiness in the home, an emptiness that spoke of absence, of loss, of spaces waiting to be filled. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Colorado farmland. Amos stood in the barn doorway, checking the leather straps on his team of horses. The wagon needed loading with flour sacks for delivery to town, a task he'd been putting off all week. "I'll be joining you today," Angel announced. Appearing beside him with such quiet steps he nearly startled, Amos frowned. "That ain't necessary. I have business at the general store," she said simply, already climbing onto the wagon seat with surprising agility for her age. Her gray shawl was neat around her shoulders, her silver hair tucked properly beneath a modest bonnet. Seeing no graceful way to refuse, Amos clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, following the rutted trail toward town. Morning dew sparkled on the prairie grass, and meadowlarks called from fence posts, but the beauty was lost on Amos. He sat stiffly, hands tight on the reins, painfully aware of the whispers that would greet them in town. The 2-hour journey passed in silence, broken only by the rhythm of hooves, and the occasional grunt when the wagon hit a particularly deep rut. Angel sat straight back beside him, hands folded in her lap, seemingly content with the quiet as they approached the town's main street. Heads turned and conversations stopped. Amos heard the first snicker from outside the saloon, where 3 men lounged against the hitching post. "Well, if it ain't the bridegroom and his young bride," one called out, prompting guffaws from his companions. 2 women standing outside the millinery shop whispered behind their hands, eyes wide as they stared at Angel. "A grandmother," one said loudly enough to carry. "Can you imagine?" Amos' jaw clenched so tight it ached. But Angel moved through the whispers and stares like a ship through water, her head high as she made her way to the general store. Inside, she selected thread and needles with careful consideration, while Amos arranged his flour delivery with the proprietor. The bell above the door jangled, suddenly as a young mother burst in, a small child limp in her arms. "Please," she cried, "I need medicine. Tommy's burning up with fever." "Doctor's out on calls," the shopkeeper said helplessly. "Won't be back till evening." "If I may," Angel stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "I know something that might help." She turned to the shopkeeper. "Do you stock willow bark?" The mother clutched her child closer. "Who are you?" "Someone who's nursed more fevers than she can count," Angel replied. "Willow bark tea and cold compresses will bring the fever down, if you're willing to trust an old woman's wisdom." Desperation won over doubt in the mother's eyes. "Please, help him." Angel gathered her supplies efficiently. Willow bark, clean cloth, a small pot for brewing. Her movements were sure and practiced as she prepared the tea, and showed the mother how to position the compresses. Amos found himself watching from the corner, where he'd been trying to fade into the woodwork. There was something compelling about the way Angel worked. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, just quiet competence born of long experience. By sunset, word had spread through town that Tommy's fever had broken. The whispers changed tone. "A healer," people murmured. "Knows her remedies, that one." The mockery faded, replaced by thoughtful looks and considering nods. Loading the empty wagon for the journey home, Amos noticed how differently people regarded Angel now. The same women who had whispered behind their hands earlier now smiled and nodded as she passed. Sun was sinking toward the horizon as they started home, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The horses plodded steadily, knowing they were headed back to their barn. Amos found himself breaking the silence. "Where did you learn about healing?" The question came out gruffer than he'd intended. Angel's hands remained folded in her lap, her eyes on the distant mountains. "The Lord kept me busy with orphans when others would not," she said simply. The words hung in the air between them. Amos stared at the reins in his hands, feeling the smooth leather warm from his grip. Something shifted in his understanding of this woman beside him, but he couldn't yet name what it was. The wagon rolled on toward home as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The following days settled into a gentle rhythm at the Yoder farm. Angel moved through the household with quiet purpose, her presence gradually weaving into their daily lives like threads in a tapestry. She rose before dawn, her footsteps soft on the wooden floors as she kindled the kitchen fire and set water to boil for morning coffee. One bright morning, she found Jacob whittling aimlessly at a stick near the woodpile. She settled beside him on a stump, her movements careful and deliberate. "Would you like to learn something special?" she asked, pulling a fresh willow branch from her apron pocket. Jacob nodded, eyes bright with curiosity. "Watch closely now," Angel said, her weathered hands working the knife with practiced skill. "First, we choose the straightest part, where the bark is smooth." She demonstrated each cut, explaining patiently how to hollow the center and shape the mouthpiece. From the barn doorway, Amos paused in his work, watching as his son leaned in close, following Angel's instructions with unusual focus. The boy's face lit up when he produced his first clear whistle note. "Look, Pa." Jacob called out excitedly, but Amos just nodded briefly and disappeared back into the barn, unwilling to acknowledge the warmth that scene stirred in his chest. Inside the house, Mary sat at Angel's feet most afternoons, learning to guide needle and thread through sturdy fabric. "Like this?" she would ask, holding up her work for inspection. "That's right, child," Angel would reply, adjusting Mary's tiny fingers. "A good seam holds life together, just like the good Lord's love holds us." Her voice was warm honey, sweet with wisdom earned through years of making do. As evening shadows lengthened across the floorboards, the children began lingering after supper instead of rushing outside to play. They gathered close as Angel shared tales from her years on the Santa Fe Trail, speaking of vast prairies under star-filled skies, of wagon wheels creaking through dust and storm, of faith tested and renewed. "My Henry," she would say, speaking of her late husband, "always said the trail teaches what truly matters. Not fancy things or pride, but trust in God and helping hands when times get hard." Her words painted pictures of survival, of communities coming together, of hope outlasting hardship. Amos found himself pausing in his evening tasks, listening despite himself. The stories awakened memories of his own childhood, of community gatherings and shared meals, of a time before grief had frozen his heart. One evening, after Angel had served a rich rabbit stew that had even Amos reaching for seconds, she began humming as she worked. The tune grew into words, a hymn in German that Amos had not heard since his mother sang it at bedtime. "Gottes die Lieb." Angel's voice lifted clear and true in the lamplight, and something cracked in Amos' chest. He saw Mary's eyes grow wide with wonder, while Jacob's fingers stilled on his new whistle. The familiar words wrapped around them like a warm blanket. speaking of God's endless love. For a moment, Amos could almost feel his mother's presence. Smell the bread she used to bake, hear her gentle voice teaching him these same verses. Angel rose to gather the empty bowls, but suddenly swayed, one hand pressing against her chest. The motion was slight, but Amos caught it, saw the brief flash of pain cross her face before she steadied herself. "Are you unwell?" he asked, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. "Just a touch of tiredness," Angel replied, her smile gentle but firm. "Nothing a good night's rest won't cure." She continued clearing the table as if nothing had happened, but Amos noticed she moved more carefully afterward. The evening deepened, and the first snowflakes of the season began drifting past the windows. Mary tugged at Angel's skirts. "Tell us about the time you helped those orphan children," she pleaded. "The ones caught in the blizzard." "Yes, please," Jacob added, settling closer to the hearth. "Was it a storm like this one coming?" The lamplight flickered warm against the gathering darkness outside, casting soft shadows on the walls. Angel adjusted her shawl and leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant with memory as the children waited eagerly for her words. Amos remained in his seat, telling himself he stayed only to be sure Angel showed no more signs of weakness. But something in him knew it was more than that. The scene before him, his children's faces glowing with interest, the comfortable warmth of the room, the soft voice beginning another tale. It felt like something he had forgotten his home could be. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a whisper of change in the winter air. 2 days after the first snowfall, Amos guided his team home from the timber stand, the wagon bed loaded with fresh-cut logs. His muscles ached from hours of swinging the axe, but satisfaction warmed him despite the chill air. The wood would keep his family warm through winter. His contentment vanished when he spotted an unfamiliar bay horse tied to his gatepost. The animal's quality tack and gleaming coat spoke of city ownership. Amos' jaw tightened as he drew his wagon to a halt. Inside his kitchen, a well-dressed man sat at his table. Angel stood near the stove, her face carefully neutral as she poured coffee into his mother's old china cup. The stranger rose, extending a hand. "Mr. Yoder, I'm Theodore Banks, attorney from Denver." His grip was soft, unused to labor. "I represent the Blue Ridge Mining Company." Amos remained standing, his work-roughened hands clasped behind his back. "What brings a mining lawyer to my farm?" Banks pulled papers from his leather satchel, spreading them across the scrubbed wooden table. "There appears to be a question regarding water rights to Tucker Creek. My clients maintain the water belongs to their existing claims upstream." "That creek waters my fields," Amos said, his voice low but firm. "Has done since my father cleared this land. My deed is clear." "Ah, but there are prior claims." Banks touched one document with a manicured finger. "The company's surveys show nothing that changes my right to that water." Amos planted his palms on the table, leaning forward. "My deed is recorded proper in town." Angel moved quietly in the background, but Amos noticed her shoulders stiffen at the mention of water rights. Her eyes had taken on a distant look, as if searching through memory. Banks gathered his papers with practiced smoothness. "We hope to settle this amicably, Mr. Yoder, but if you insist on being difficult, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action." "Good day." He nodded to Angel, settled his hat, and stepped out into the afternoon light. Amos watched through the window as the lawyer mounted his horse. "The creek is the lifeblood of this farm," he said, more to himself than Angel. "Without it—" "Wait here," Angel said suddenly. She climbed the stairs to the loft where she slept, her steps quick despite her age. Amos heard the creak of her trunk opening. When she returned, she carried a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with faded ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the knot. "My Henry," she said softly, "worked with survey teams and treaty parties across 3 territories. He kept copies of everything he witnessed." She spread the documents carefully, revealing maps and papers yellow with age. "I believe these may help prove your claim." Amos stared at the neat rows of script, official seals still visible after decades. "These show the original water rights?" Angel nodded. "And the treaties that established them. Before the mining companies came. Why didn't you mention these before now?" Amos demanded, suspicion warring with hope in his chest. Angel smoothed a wrinkled corner with gentle fingers. "The Lord brings forth what is needed in His time," she said simply. "Not before." Amos studied her face, searching for deceit but finding only calm certainty. The papers looked genuine, their age and official markings suggesting truth in her words. That evening, after the children were abed, Amos sat alone in the darkened kitchen. The lawyer's threats echoed in his mind, mingled with memories of his father's sweat building this farm. From the next room came the soft creak of Angel's rocking chair and Mary's sleepy murmur as Angel hummed an old hymn. For the first time since burying his wife, Amos felt the weight of his pride and anger lift enough to pray. No words came to his lips, but in his heart, he reached toward forgotten faith. Like water seeping into parched ground, something long buried began to soften. Angel's voice drifted through the quiet house, singing about God's steadfast love. The same love, Amos realized, that might have guided this strange woman to his door with the very papers needed to save his land. He remained silent in the darkness, wrestling with the possibility that the Lord's mysterious ways included sending him not the young bride he'd expected, but exactly the help his family needed. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the fields, reminding Amos of the threats gathering like storm clouds. The mining company would return, and the fight for Tucker Creek was just beginning. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, born from faded papers and a faithful heart. The November snow lay thick across the Colorado hills, transforming familiar paths into treacherous drifts. What once took 2 hours by wagon now stretched to 3 or more, each journey into town becoming a test of endurance. Amos felt the weight of the mining company's threats pressing down heavier than the snow itself. Dawn found him already outside, his breath clouding in the bitter air as he swung his axe. The steady thud of steel against wood echoed across the frozen landscape. Inside his chest, worry gnawed like a hungry wolf. The lawyer's words haunted his dreams, making rest elusive. Angel watched from the kitchen window as Amos worked himself to exhaustion day after day. She saw how he drove the cattle through icy winds, mended fences with frozen fingers, and stacked cord after cord of split wood until his shoulders trembled with fatigue. "Let me help," she offered one morning, reaching for a bucket to fetch water. Amos frowned at her thin shoulders beneath the wool shawl. "That's no work for." He stopped himself, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes. "These old hands still know honest work," Angel said softly. She demonstrated to Jacob and Mary how to carry smaller buckets, showing them how to move carefully across the slippery yard. "Better to make 4 trips with a lighter load than spill one heavy bucket," she explained. In the kitchen, she taught Mary to measure flour with careful precision. "The Lord provides," Angel said, "but we must be wise with His gifts." She showed the child how to sweep every precious grain back into the barrel, wasting nothing. The short winter days grew shorter. One evening, as wind rattled the shutters, Amos stabbed his fork into his supper plate. "That mining outfit means to starve us out before spring," he growled. "Taking water that's rightfully ours." His fist crashed against the table. Mary jumped, dropping her spoon. Jacob's eyes went wide with fear. "Amos," Angel's voice cut through his anger, like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. "Anger makes a poor weapon against injustice. Patience and truth must lead this fight." The children's frightened faces struck Amos' heart harder than Angel's gentle rebuke. Shame colored his cheeks as he watched Mary's trembling hands retrieve her spoon. His own father had never raised his voice at table. "I reckon you're right," he muttered, the words tasting bitter as medicine but bringing similar relief. The tension eased from the room like a held breath, finally released. Later that night, after the children's prayers and goodnights, Amos descended the stairs for a final check of the banked fire. Lamplight spilled from the kitchen doorway, and he heard Angel's voice, soft but clear, reading familiar words. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Amos paused in the shadows of the stairwell. How long since he'd heard those verses? Not since Sarah's passing, he realized with a pang. Angel looked up from her worn Bible, the lamplight catching silver in her hair. "Would you care to listen a while?" Pride urged him to refuse, to retreat upstairs to his lonely vigil. But something in her steady gaze held him. Without speaking, he lowered himself into the chair beside the hearth. Angel's voice continued, "Warm and sure as a mother's hand on fevered brow, he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Amos stared into the glowing coals. The familiar words washed over him like spring rain on winter-hardened ground. He remembered his mother reading these same verses, remembered the peace they once brought. Though he spoke no word of thanks or agreement, he remained until the lamp burned low, letting Angel's voice and David's ancient comfort fill the kitchen's midnight quiet. The fire settled with a soft crash of embers. Angel closed her Bible, but the psalm seemed to linger in the air like the scent of warm bread. Amos felt his knotted shoulders loosen, his worried mind growing still. The mining company's threats still loomed like storm clouds on the horizon, but somehow they seemed less terrible in the wake of those ageless words of trust and protection. He rose at last, nodding briefly to Angel before climbing the stairs to his cold room. Though troubled thoughts still circled like crows, they seemed to settle at a distance, held at bay by the strange comfort of shared silence and sacred words. The small wooden church stood bright against the winter dusk, its windows glowing with lamplight. Inside, rough-hewn benches creaked under the weight of nearly every soul in the county. The revival meeting had drawn folks from as far as 20 miles out, their wagons and horses crowding the trampled snow outside. Amos shifted uncomfortably on the hard bench. He hadn't planned to come, but Mary had begged to hear the singing, and Jacob had wanted to see his friend from town. Angel sat beside them, straight-backed and serene in her dark dress, her silver hair neat beneath a simple bonnet. The traveling preacher's voice rolled through the cramped space like distant thunder. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, "who among you will stand and testify to the Lord's grace?" Amos stared at his boots. He had nothing to say about grace. Not since Sarah died. A rustle of fabric drew his attention. Angel was rising slowly to her feet, her face calm but determined. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Amos felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. What would this woman who lived under his roof say to these people? "I am a widow twice over," Angel began, her voice clear and steady. "I have buried 2 good men and walked the Santa Fe Trail until my feet bled. I have nursed orphans that others turned away, and lately I have known the sting of ridicule." The church grew still. Even the children stopped fidgeting. "But in all these things," she continued, "God's faithfulness has never failed. When grief threatened to break me, his strength became mine. When doors closed, he opened windows. When mockery followed me, his love proved sufficient." Amos saw Mrs. Peterson, the mother whose child Angel had healed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Others were weeping openly too. "I stand before you as living proof that the Lord's mercy has no age limit," Angel said softly. "His purpose for us doesn't end with youth or begin with strength. He uses the weak to confound the mighty, and he makes beauty from ashes if we only trust his timing." She sat down amid profound silence. Amos couldn't look at her. Her words had stripped away his carefully constructed walls, exposing the bitterness he'd nursed since Sarah's death. He had blamed God, turned his back on faith, convinced himself that anger was stronger than trust. Now shame burned in his throat. The service ended with "Amazing Grace," the harmony swelling to the rafters. As people filed out into the crisp night air, something had changed. Neighbors who had whispered and laughed weeks ago now approached. Angel with warm handshakes and earnest smiles. "Miss Angel, might you like this gooseberry pie?" Mrs. Peterson pressed a covered dish into her hands. "It's still warm. We'd be honored if you'd join our quilting circle," another woman added. "My Thomas still talks about that willow bark tea," a young mother said. "You've got a gift for healing." Sure enough, Amos watched from the wagon as person after person greeted Angel with genuine respect. The mockery that had followed their strange arrival had transformed into something like reverence. He saw now what his pride had blinded him to before, the quiet dignity that ran deeper than age or circumstance. The ride home stretched beneath a canopy of stars, crystal clear in the winter sky. Mary and Jacob lay bundled in quilts in the wagon bed, their breathing deep and steady. Angel sat beside Amos on the wagon seat, softly humming, "Be Thou My Vision." The lamplight swaying from the wagon's frame cast gentle shadows across her face. Amos cleared his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, the words feeling strange and insufficient. He glanced upward at the vast starry expanse, adding a silent prayer, his first intentional one in years. Angel's humming continued, a peaceful thread weaving through the night. As they crested the last hill, their farmhouse came into view, windows glowing with the warmth of home. The sight caught in Amos' chest, not with the usual ache of Sarah's absence, but with something new. Something that felt almost like hope. He didn't have words for how Angel's testimony had begun to thaw his frozen faith. But as they drew near to the house that no longer felt empty, he recognized that something was shifting. Like winter giving way to spring, the March winds swept across Colorado's high country, carrying whispers of change. Snow retreated from the south-facing slopes, revealing patches of earth that had slumbered beneath winter's blanket. On the Yoder farm, new life stirred both outside and within. Angel stood at the kitchen window, watching Mary and Jacob in the freshly thawed garden plot. Her gentle instructions carried across the morning air as the children worked the soil with small tools. "That's right, Mary. Plant the pea seeds just deep enough to cover them. Jacob, mind the rows straight now." The children had taken to gardening with unexpected enthusiasm. Jacob, who once declared such work boring, now proudly measured the straight lines for seedbeds. Mary sang softly while dropping seeds into the dark earth, her small fingers careful with each one. Amos paused his fence mending to observe them. Angel had suggested rotating the wheat field with clover to enrich the soil, something his father never tried. But her wisdom, earned from years on frontier farms, had proven sound time and again. The winter wheat showed stronger growth where he'd followed her advice. Inside the farmhouse, changes bloomed like the first crocuses. New curtains, sewn from fabric Angel had chosen carefully at the general store, brightened windows that had gathered dust since Sarah's passing. Their cheerful pattern caught the morning light, throwing warm squares across the plank floor. In the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread filled the air. Mary stood on a stool beside Angel, her small hands learning the rhythm of kneading dough. 6 times over, child," Angel instructed. "Feel how it gets smoother with each turn." Jacob had found his own project under Angel's guidance. Together, they designed and built a sturdy sled for hauling kindling from the woodlot. His pride shone bright when Amos praised the clever rope system they'd devised for securing the loads. As spring advanced, Amos caught himself smiling more often. He didn't notice it himself, but neighbors remarked on the change. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and his laugh, once rare as gold dust, came easier now. One mild evening, when the sunset painted the sky in promises of fair weather, the Yoders hosted several neighboring families for supper. Angel had outdone herself, filling the table with roasted chicken, 3 kinds of pie, and rolls that melted like snow on the tongue. "Miss Angel," Mrs. Peterson declared, helping herself to more chicken, "I haven't tasted cooking this fine since my mother's kitchen back east." The gathered neighbors nodded in agreement. Even gruff old Mr. Henderson, known more for complaints than compliments, praised the meal. Angel sat quietly, accepting their words with graceful humility. As the evening wore on, Angel shared stories of her travels on the Santa Fe Trail. She spoke of buffalo herds that darkened the horizon, of friendship with native traders, of faith tested and strengthened through hardship. The children gathered close, and even the adults leaned in, captured by her gentle voice painting pictures of a West both wild and wonderful. Amos watched his guests' faces in the lamplight. Here was Henderson, who'd scoffed loudest at Angel's arrival, now asking earnestly about her methods for treating cattle fever. There sat the Miller boys, usually restless as March winds, sitting still as stones as Angel described a prairie fire she'd outrun. The house seemed to glow from within, warm with conversation and community. When the last wagon departed into the starlit evening, Amos stood in his kitchen, struck by the realization that his home felt truly alive again. Dishes waited in washing basins, crumbs dotted the tablecloth, and the lingering sense of food and fellowship filled every corner. This was how a home should feel, not like the tomb of memories it had become. After Sarah's death, Angel began gathering plates, humming softly as she worked. Amos stepped forward to help, their movements falling into an easy rhythm they'd developed over the past months. When the kitchen was set to rights, he walked her to the porch as had become their custom. In the mild spring air, beneath a sky scattered with stars, Amos did something he hadn't planned. He reached for Angel's hand, holding it briefly but firmly in his own. The gesture spoke what his pride still couldn't say, that she belonged here, that his home had become hers too. Angel's smile was gentle in the darkness, but Amos felt her hand tremble in his. She swayed slightly, catching herself against the doorframe. His heart jumped with concern as she steadied herself, waving off his worried look with her free hand. "Just tired," she murmured, but her voice held something that left Amos uneasy. Outside, the last patches of snow retreated from the garden edges. Inside, warmth bloomed like the first spring flowers, beautiful but delicate, precious in its uncertainty. The April morning dawned clear and cool, promising another day of spring's gentle awakening. Amos stood in the barn, checking the leather on his work harness when he heard horses approaching. The sound was wrong, too many hooves, moving too fast for neighbors. 3 riders appeared at his gate, dust rising behind their mounts. Their rifles hung low on saddle hooks, a clear message in their placement. Amos set down his tools and walked out to meet them, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Mr. Yoder," the lead rider called, not bothering to dismount. His voice carried the hard edge of someone used to being obeyed. "Mining company sent us with a friendly reminder. Your time here is running short." Amos planted his feet firmly. "This is my land, secured by deed and water rights. I won't be leaving." The second rider spat into the dust. "Company's fixing to make it official real soon. Judge already sees it their way." He patted the rifle at his side. "Be a shame if things got difficult. You're threatening an Amish farmer?" Amos's voice remained steady, though anger burned in his chest. "A widower with 2 children?" "Just explaining how things work out here," the third man sneered. "Company needs that creek water. Ain't personal." Footsteps sounded behind Amos Angel's measured tread. She appeared at his shoulder, her presence as steady as the mountains themselves. Her gray hair caught the morning light like silver, and her eyes held no fear as she gazed at the riders. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, "surely there's no need for threats when the law can settle matters properly." The lead rider shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable under her calm scrutiny. "Just delivering a message, ma'am." "Best heed it." They wheeled their horses around, kicking up more dust as they rode away. Amos watched until they disappeared around the bend, his hands clenched at his sides. Angel touched his arm gently. "Come inside, Amos. We need to talk." In the kitchen while the children played in the yard, Angel spoke frankly. Those weren't idle threats. I've seen mining companies destroy whole communities this way. What can they do? Amos demanded. I have rights. Rights mean little without the power to defend them. Angel's voice was soft but firm. We must prepare both ways, legally with those old treaties, and spiritually with prayer. The Lord tests our faith through trials. Amos sank into a chair, feeling the weight of it all, the farm, the children's future, even Angel's safety now at risk. She had become part of what he must protect, though he couldn't say exactly when that had happened. The day passed in a fog of worry. At supper, the usual cheerful chatter was missing. Mary pushed her food around her plate while Jacob kept glancing at the window, as if expecting the riders to return. Angel maintained calm conversation, speaking of ordinary things, tomorrow's weather, the new calves, Mary's improving stitches. After the dishes were cleared, Angel lit the lamp and began to sing softly. Her voice carried the old hymns that had comforted generations before them. Mary curled up beside her while Jacob sat at her feet, whittling a piece of wood. The familiar melodies seemed to ease the day's tension, wrapping them in a gentle peace. Amos watched from his chair by the fire, struck by how natural this scene had become. Angel surrounded by his children, her presence filling the empty spaces in their home. She had woven herself into their lives so gradually, so completely, that he could no longer imagine the farm without her. The lamp flickered as Angel rose to take Jacob to bed. Suddenly she stopped, one hand flying to her chest. Her face paled, and she swayed dangerously. Angel! Amos lunged forward, catching her arm before she could fall. The children froze, eyes wide with fear. I'm fine, she insisted, though her voice trembled. Just stood up too quickly. But Amos had seen this before, the shortness of breath, the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her heart. Fear bloomed in his chest, colder than any mining company's threats. Angel, he whispered, still supporting her weight. The name carried all his worry, all his questions. She patted his hand, trying to smile. I'm fine, truly. Just need to rest a moment. But her face remained pale, and her hand shook where it gripped his arm. The lamplight cast shadows across her features, highlighting the strain she tried so hard to hide. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Angel kneaded dough on the wooden table. The familiar scent of yeast filled the warm air while she worked the mixture with practiced hands. Through the open door, she could hear Amos in the barn, his steady movements punctuated by the occasional low of cattle. Mary sat at the corner of the table, carefully threading a needle as Angel had taught her. The little girl's tongue poked out in concentration, her fingers working carefully with the thread. Angel paused to wipe flour from her hands, pressing briefly against the table as a wave of dizziness passed over her. The spells had been coming more frequently now, though she'd tried to hide them. She took a deep breath and turned back to her bread making. Angel? Mary looked up, concern in her young eyes. Are you tired? Just resting a moment, dear. Angel smiled, but the room suddenly tilted sideways. Her chest tightened like an iron band squeezing her heart. Mary's scream pierced the morning quiet as Angel crumpled to the floor, her hand clutching at her chest. The sound of running boots on gravel followed, and Amos burst through the door, his face pale with fear. Angel! He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, gathering her carefully in his arms. Her slight weight startled him. When had she become so frail? He settled her into his chair by the fire, his hands trembling. Jacob appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with fright. Is Angel dying? No, Amos said sharply, then softened his tone. Go fetch some water, son. Angel's breathing came in short gasps, her face ashen. When she could finally speak, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Amos. I should have told you sooner. Told me what? His voice cracked with fear and frustration. She pressed one hand to her chest, the other gripping the chair arm. My heart has been weak for years. The doctors out west said there wasn't much to be done except rest and prayer. And you kept this from us? Anger flared in Amos's voice, born of terror. "All this time, working yourself too hard, never saying a word? I didn't want to be a burden." Tears slipped down Angel's cheeks. "You needed help with the children, the farm. I thought, I hoped." The sight of her tears dissolved Amos's anger like morning frost in sunlight. He sank to his knees beside her chair, taking her work-worn hand in his. "You're no burden, Angel. He struggled to find the words. "You're part of us now." In the corner, Mary began to cry softly. Jacob returned with the water, his own eyes bright with tears. Angel beckoned them closer, and they came, pressing against her skirts like small children seeking shelter in a storm. "There now," she soothed, though her voice still trembled. "The Lord holds all our days in his hands. We must trust his timing, not fear it." Amos watched her comfort his children, even in her weakness, and something broke open inside him. The wall of pride and grief he'd built since his wife's death crumbled away. Without conscious thought, he bowed his head. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion. For a moment, he faltered. It had been so long since he'd spoken to God. "Lord, we need your strength now. We need your healing touch for Angel. She's become..." His voice caught. "She's precious to us, Lord. Please, don't take her yet." The kitchen grew quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire. Sunlight painted patterns on the floor, and somewhere outside a meadowlark called. Angel's hand tightened in his grip, warm and present. "Amen," she whispered. Mary wiped her eyes on her apron. "Can I fetch your shawl, Angel?" "The blue one?" "That would be kind, dear." Angel smiled wearily. Jacob stood straighter, trying to be brave. "I'll bring more wood for the fire." As the children hurried to their tasks, Amos remained kneeling beside Angel's chair. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair, reminding him how she'd first appeared that day at the station, dignified and strong despite the town's whispers. Now he understood the true strength she'd carried all along. "We'll send for the doctor," he said firmly. "Amos, no arguing." He squeezed her hand gently. "You're family now. We take care of family." Angel's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she smiled. Around them, the kitchen settled into familiar sounds. Mary's footsteps upstairs, Jacob stacking wood, the bread dough rising in its bowl. The lamp flame danced, casting warm light over their gathered faces as they sat together. Fear and faith intertwined like threads in a tapestry. The morning after Angel's collapse, Amos stood at the kitchen window, watching her attempt to hang laundry. His jaw tightened as she paused, steadying herself against a post. Before she could lift another wet sheet, he strode outside. "Let me do that," he said, taking the basket from her hands. "Amos, I'm not made of glass." But her voice carried no bite, only weariness. "No arguing." He guided her toward the porch chair. "Doctor said rest, and rest you shall." Mary appeared with a quilt, tucking it around Angel's legs. The little girl hadn't strayed far from Angel's side since the collapse, as if afraid she might vanish when no one was looking. Inside the farmhouse, Amos spread papers across the kitchen table, Angel's treaty documents, his own deed, and a fresh sheet for his letter to the circuit judge. The mining company's threats weighed heavy on his mind, but Angel's health worried him more. He dipped his pen in ink, carefully describing the company's intimidation tactics. Jacob helped Angel to the table for supper, hovering close as she settled into her chair. The boy had taken to carrying water for her, insisting she mustn't strain herself. Even now he watched her lift her spoon, ready to assist. "I'm managing fine, dear one," Angel assured him with a gentle smile. After the meal, Amos found Angel in the bedroom she now used downstairs, kneeling beside her trunk. Papers and small keepsakes lay sorted in neat piles around her. "What's all this?" he asked, though dread clenched his stomach. Angel looked up, her face serene despite its pallor. "Just putting things in order." She held up a packet of yellow documents. These prove the water rights belong to the original homesteaders. If my breath runs out, you must carry this through. Don't talk that way, Amos said roughly, fighting the burn in his throat. We must speak plain, Amos. She folded her hands in her lap. I've lived long enough to know when time grows short. Tears threatened, but he blinked them back. I won't lose you. Or the land. Angel's smile held both warmth and wisdom. I already count myself blessed, she said softly. The Lord led me here, to this home, to these children. She touched his arm. To you. Amos caught her hand, holding it tight. You've brought life back to this house. The children need you. His voice dropped. I need you. Then we shall trust God's timing. She squeezed his fingers. But promise me you'll fight for what's right, no matter what comes. I promise, he whispered later that night. After the children were asleep, Amos sat alone by the fire. His Bible lay open on his knee, pages soft with age. The words seemed clearer now than they had in years, as if Angel's faith had cleaned the dust from his eyes. The legal petition lay on the table beside him, waiting for his signature. By lamplight, he read through it one final time. The words were strong and true, backed by Angel's carefully preserved documents. They proved his right to the water, the land, the home he'd built for his family, a family that now included the silver-haired woman sleeping in the next room. Amos dipped his pen in ink. His hand was steady as he signed his name, claiming not just his property rights, but his responsibility to defend those he loved. The ink dried black against the paper, a promise made in more ways than one. He stoked the fire, listening to the quiet breathing of his household. Tomorrow he would send the petition to the circuit judge. Tomorrow he would continue learning to be both strong and gentle, as Angel had taught him. Tomorrow he would show his children how to fight with dignity and faith. But tonight, he simply sat in the firelight, his Bible open, his heart at peace despite the battles ahead. Through the wall, he heard Angel's soft humming, a hymn of praise, even now. The sound wrapped around him like a blessing, a reminder that some gifts came in unexpected packages, arriving not as planned but exactly when needed. Setting the petition aside, Amos bowed his head. The words of prayer came easier now, flowing from a heart that had remembered how to trust. In the next room, Angel's hymn continued, a quiet accompaniment to his whispered thanks. The early morning sun cast long shadows as Amos helped Angel into the wagon. She moved slowly, each step measured, but her eyes held determination. He had tried to convince her to stay home, worried the journey would tax her strength too much. This is our fight, she had insisted, gripping her wooden cane. The Lord didn't preserve those papers all these years for me to sit idle now. The children watched from the porch as Amos carefully arranged quilts around Angel in the wagon seat. Mary had tucked her favorite doll into the blankets, while Jacob stood straight-backed, trying to be brave. We'll be back before sunset, Amos promised them. The neighbor woman who'd come to watch them nodded, shooing them inside for breakfast. The wagon wheels creaked over rutted roads for 2 hours. Amos kept glancing at Angel, noting how she pressed one hand to her chest on the rougher stretches. Yet she sat tall, the leather document case clutched in her lap. The county courthouse loomed ahead, its wooden steps already crowded with people. Miners in dirty boots clustered on one side, their faces hard. Townsfolk gathered opposite, including many who had come to know Angel's healing touch and gentle wisdom. Amos circled the wagon around back, where the steps weren't quite so steep. He helped Angel down, supporting her arm as she got her footing with the cane. Together they climbed slowly toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Wooden benches creaked as people shifted to make way. The mining company's lawyer stood at the front, his suit fine and his manner slick. He arranged papers on the table with flourish, casting confident smiles at the miners. The judge entered, a stern-faced man with gray at his temples. After calling the court to order, he nodded to the mining company's lawyer to begin. The lawyer launched into his argument with grand gestures. These new surveys clearly show the creek lies within company territory. Modern progress demands we develop these resources. We cannot let outdated claims stand in the way of progress. He produced maps and documents, each seeming to support his case. Doubt rippled through the courtroom. Amos felt his throat tighten as he presented his own deed, explaining how his father had worked the land before him. The judge frowned over the papers. The deed seems valid, but these new surveys raise questions about the original boundaries. A heavy silence fell. Then Angel stirred beside Amos. Using her cane, she pushed herself to her feet. Her silver hair caught the light from the high windows as she opened the leather case. "Your Honor," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I have documents that speak to this matter." All eyes turned to her as she drew out the yellowed papers, carefully preserved through decades of frontier travel. Her hands trembled slightly, but her words remained steady as she explained their history. "My late husband served as witness to the original territory treaties. These papers detail the water rights granted to homesteaders, including specific provisions for the creek that runs through Mr. Yoder's land." She traced the lines of text with one finger. The boundaries were marked by the old oak grove and the lightning split rock, landmarks that still stand today. No new survey can erase what was rightfully granted. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents with intense focus. The mining company's lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him to silence. Minutes stretched like hours as he read through every page. Finally, he looked up. "These treaties are binding and clear. The creek and surrounding land belong to Mr. Yoder, as stated in the original grants." He struck his gavel. "This case is dismissed." Joy erupted from the townsfolk's benches. The miners stormed out, their boots heavy on the wooden floors. Their lawyer gathered his papers with sharp movements, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Amos found Angel's hand and gripped it tight. Tears blurred his vision as neighbors surrounded them, offering congratulations and thanks. The preacher pressed forward to shake their hands, while the mother whose child Angel had healed hugged her carefully. "The Lord's timing is perfect," Angel whispered, squeezing Amos' fingers. Though her face showed fatigue, her eyes shone with quiet victory. They made their way slowly down the courthouse steps, surrounded by well-wishers. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden boards beneath their feet as townsfolk walked beside them, some carrying Angel's documents, others steadying her other arm when the steps grew tricky. At the bottom, Amos helped Angel into the wagon once more, tucking the quilts around her with gentle care. The leather case with its precious papers rested safe between them as they started the journey home, where 2 children and a future secured by grace awaited their return. The farmhouse glowed with warmth as neighbors crowded inside, bringing dishes of steaming food and well-worn instruments. Fiddle music filled the kitchen while children darted between grown-ups' legs. The victory celebration had sprung up naturally, with wagons arriving as word spread through town. Angel sat in her favorite chair by the hearth, accepting plates of cornbread and apple pie from smiling women. Her cheeks held more color than they had in days, though she still kept one hand near her heart. The children hovered close, sneaking bites from her plate and grinning. Amos stood near the stone fireplace, watching the scene unfold. His home hadn't held this much joy since before his first wife's passing. The sight of Angel surrounded by their neighbors, her silver hair catching the lamplight, stirred something deep in his chest. He cleared his throat and tapped his cup with a spoon. The room gradually quieted, faces turning toward him expectantly. "Folks," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Today we saved our land, thanks to Angel's courage and wisdom." He paused, gathering strength. "But she's given us so much more than papers and testimony. She brought light back into these dark rooms, taught my children to laugh again, showed me how to pray when bitterness had sealed my lips." Angel's eyes glistened as Amos moved to stand before her chair. The crowd drew in a collective breath. I asked you here once by contract, he said softly. But now I'm asking by choice and with my whole heart. He knelt carefully, taking her trembling hand. Will you be my wife, Angel? Mother to these children who already love you? Partner in whatever days the Lord grants us? Tears spilled down Angel's cheeks as she squeezed his fingers. Yes, she whispered. With all my heart, yes. The preacher stepped forward from the crowd, his Bible already in hand. No time like the present, he said warmly. If you're both willing? They stood together before the hearth, Angel leaning slightly on Amos' arm. The preacher spoke of God's perfect timing and redeeming love. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in cheers and happy sobs. As evening deepened, the guests gradually departed, leaving behind covered dishes and warm blessings. The family settled onto the porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Jacob and Mary snuggled close to Angel's sides. Mother, Mary said softly, testing the word. Will you tell us a story? Mother, Jacob echoed, his small hand finding hers. Angel gathered them closer, her heart too full for words. Amos sat beside them, his arm steady around her shoulders. Peace settled over the porch like a familiar quilt, wrapping them in belonging, and Grace. The farmhouse kitchen glowed golden in the gathering dusk. Angel sat in her carved rocker near the hearth. Mary curled drowsily in her lap while the flames cast dancing shadows on the wall. Her silver hair caught the lamplight as she swayed gently back and forth, humming an old German lullaby. Jacob sprawled on the braided rug nearby, his wooden carvings scattered around him as he drifted between sleep and wakefulness. Scent of fresh-baked bread and beef stew still lingered in the air, mixing with the sweet pine smoke from the fireplace. Angel had insisted on cooking despite her weakness, saying a mother's work fed more than just empty bellies. Now dirty dishes soaked in the wash basin, testament to another meal shared in contentment. The back door creaked open, bringing a gust of cold air as Amos stepped inside. He stamped snow from his boots and hung his heavy coat by the door. His cheeks were ruddy from the winter wind, but his eyes softened at the sight before him. This kitchen, once as hollow as his grieving heart, now overflowed with the warmth of family. The animals are settled for the night, he said quietly, moving to warm his hands by the fire. Storms coming in from the north. Angel smiled up at him, her hand absently smoothing Mary's dark hair. The Lord provides shelter from every storm, she replied. Though her voice remained gentle, the words carried the weight of truth, hard-won through years of trial. Amos knelt beside her rocker, taking her free hand in his work-roughened one. That he does, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I thank him every day for leading you here, though I was too blind to see his purpose at first. He bowed his head, speaking directly to heaven now. Thank you, Lord, for second chances, for your mercy when I turned away, for sending us Angel when we needed her most, though I didn't know it. His prayer grew stronger, filling the quiet kitchen. Thank you for protecting our land, our home, our family. Most of all, thank you for teaching this stubborn man to trust again. Angel squeezed his hand as tears slipped down her cheeks. Mary stirred, reaching up to touch her mother's face. Don't cry, Mama, she whispered. These are happy tears. Little one, Angel assured her, pulling both children close as Amos wrapped his arms around them all. Jacob sat up, grinning. Like when you cried at the wedding? Exactly like that, Angel laughed softly. Outside, snow began falling in earnest, big flakes drifting past the windows like feathers. But inside, the family remained snug and warm, protected by love and faith restored. Angel's voice rose clear and sweet in the lamplight, beginning the first verse of Amazing Grace. Mary joined in immediately, her high child's voice twining with her mother's. Jacob added his own eager contribution, and finally Amos's deep bass completed the harmony. The hymn filled every corner of the kitchen, rising past the wooden beams to heaven itself. Beyond the windows, the storm swept across their hard-won fields, but it held no power over the peace within. Here, in this once broken home made whole again, God's grace had truly proved sufficient for all things. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.